Hello, my name is Christina Osmeyer, and I am a member of the Dole Institute of Politics Student Advisory Board. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending tonight's presentation. The Dole Student Advisory Board is composed of KU students committed to the work of the Dole Institute. We attend regular meetings, assist at events like this, and plan an SAB-sponsored program every semester. Members of the SAB receive great opportunities to network with our special guests. If you're a student and would like to join, please contact the Dole Institute. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you. If you enjoyed tonight's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website email. Your attendance and feedback help shape future programming. Before we begin tonight, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the interview, we will have some time for audience questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student helper with a microphone will come to you. Please ask just one brief question. And now, I'd like to introduce to you Jay Schaefer, Kansas Public Radio News Director and Morning Edition host.
Hello, and thanks for being here this evening. I am Jay Schaefer, the News Director of Kansas Public Radio, and my radio station is celebrating its 60th anniversary, and we're very pleased to be able to partner with the Dole Institute of Politics to bring Scott Horsley here this evening. If you listen to NPR News, you undoubtedly know that Scott Horsley is NPR's White House correspondent. He covers the policy and politics of the Obama administration with an emphasis on economic issues. At Kansas Public Radio, we're all about Kansas, and we certainly love to bring someone in with a Kansas connection. Scott Horsley does not have a Kansas connection, but he was born and raised in Denver, which is maybe not Midwestern values, but near Midwestern values. And he does have a sister that lives in Kansas City, so he'll get to spend some time with her tomorrow. The 2012 campaign was Scott's third presidential race. He also covered John McCain's White House bid in 2008 and John Kerry's campaign in 2004. But after covering those campaigns, he was able to follow President Obama. And before taking his White House beat, Scott was a business reporter for the NPR, based in San Diego, and prior to that worked for the NPR affiliate KPBS in San Diego. During his long and award-winning career, Scott has put in time at a number of radio stations, including those in Tampa, Florida, and Boston, and Concord, New Hampshire. He earned a bachelor's degree from Harvard and an MBA from San Diego State. He now lives in Washington, D.C. with his two dogs that I'm sure he's eager to get back to. Two dogs, just interestingly enough, named Rufus and Rosie. Maybe we'll hear more about them, I'm not sure. He began his professional career in the trenches, working as a lowly production assistant for NPR's Morning Edition. Hopefully, Dole Institute Director Bill Lacey will be able to get Scott to relate some of the behind-the-scenes stories from the campaign trail and from the White House. And if you would join me now in giving a warm Kansas welcome to Scott Horsley from Colorado.
Scott, welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. It's great to have you here tonight.
Thank you. Great to be here and great to celebrate the 60th anniversary of our station here.
Yeah, that's awesome. Let's start with that. Talk a little bit about what it means to be able to come out to Kansas for the 60th birthday of one of the local affiliates.
Well, of course, we spent a lot of time here in Kansas during the campaign. It's familiar territory. No, but one of the real strengths, I think, of National Public Radio is that we try to be national public radio, and a bedrock strength of that is our partnership with the member stations, whether it's here in Kansas or in, just to pick states at random, Ohio and Florida and Iowa and New Hampshire. But we always rely on our member stations to kind of be our eyes and ears all over the country where some of the big television networks maybe don't have a big presence. And since I came up through that system, as Jay mentioned, I started out working for commercial radio stations, but I gravitated into the public radio system, and I worked for our member station in Tampa and out in California, and had the privilege in both of those settings of contributing to our national news magazines. And now whenever I hear a good reporter from somewhere outside Washington, I'm just glad that I work for an organization that has that kind of roots all over the country. Howard Burkus, one of my colleagues, used to tell the story of the early days of public radio, going up to Alaska and taking a bush plane into some remote village, and landing on skis and getting out of the plane, and going up to one of the sort of leaders of the village and introducing himself and saying, "I'm Howard Burkus. I'm from National Public Radio." And then getting ready to give his usual spiel that he would give to explain what National Public Radio was to someone who might not be familiar with it. And he says the head man in the village kind of looks over his shoulder at the airplane and says, "Is Susan Stamberg coming too?" So we have long had a wide reach, and we have an important place in communities like Lawrence and all over the country.
Great. Let's start by going back. Tell us a little bit about some of your early years, your education, and how you got interested in journalism.
Well, Jay and I were swapping stories. I kind of came up the traditional route, which was I was a radio station rat. As a high school kid, I was a little bit of a ham, and I was interested in being on the radio. And Jay mentioned I started my professional career at Morning Edition. What that means is I actually got paid when I started working for Morning Edition, but I'd been doing radio for a long time before that on an unpaid basis. And when I was in high school, there were some commercial stations in Denver that got the crazy idea of putting young people on the radio. One was going to be an evening talk show, just like a regular call-in show, except it was going to be hosted by a couple of teenagers. And I auditioned for that, didn't get the job. But around the same time, a rival radio station started up a news magazine hosted by teenagers that aired at the great hour of 5 a.m. on Sunday mornings. And one of the lessons of radio is that producing a news magazine is much more labor intensive than producing a talk show. So they needed a lot more people. They couldn't be as selective, and I got that gig. And even at 5 a.m. Sunday mornings, I would have friends in my Boy Scout troop who'd said, "Oh, I heard you when we were going hunting," or my neighbor would say, "Oh, my insomnia was acting up, and I heard you." And so that was a rush, and I enjoyed it. And so when I went to college, I volunteered at the college radio station, and never thinking I would make a career of this, because how could you make a career of radio? But saying, I'll just keep doing it, a little bit longer, and thinking one day I'll have to go get a real job, and luckily 30 years later, I haven't had to get a real job yet.
Sounds familiar. Talk about how you landed at NPR. You were doing kind of the business beat at first, and then because this is the one, how you got there, but then how that transitioned into covering presidential campaigns.
Yeah, I don't exactly know, but I'll tell you I'll tell you the part of the story. I can't really answer that question, but when I was still in high school in Denver, I had an after-school job working for a bookstore. Some of y'all might know the Tattered Cover Bookstore. It's kind of a famous bookstore in Denver. And I was a shipping clerk. I would package up books to send to people in Lawrence or anywhere in the country who might have chosen to order it from the Tattered Cover. And that was the first time I had ever heard this thing called National Public Radio. In the shipping office of the bookstore, we always had a radio, and the women that worked there would always be listening to All Things Considered in the afternoon, which was partly just to pass the tedium of unwrapping books and wrapping them up and shipping them off and stuff. But also, it was strategic, because every time there would be an author or a book mentioned on All Things Considered, you could be sure that within a few hours or a few days, people would be coming into the bookstore asking for that book. And often they would have been busy doing something. I didn't catch the name of the book, but it was about a cottage in the wilderness and whatever. So the women that worked in the back room had instructions to write down the name and author of any book that was mentioned. And of course, in those days, you didn't have the internet, so you couldn't go back and recreate the story if you'd missed it. So this was a sort of a marketing advantage for us. And I discovered this thing called public radio. So when I was interested in finding an internship, I sort of brazenly rode off to Washington, D.C. and said, do you have any openings for a summer intern? And a guy named Chuck Bailey, who was running the newsroom in those days, said, yeah, what the heck, we'll take a flyer and give you a chance. They didn't have really a formal internship program in those days like we do now. But I got to come and just observe how they did morning edition and was fascinated by it. And that was kind of my first thinking that maybe this is something that's going to be more than just a high school pastime. And I was always sort of interested in business, and I was a general assignment reporter, but I'd always be the one who would take the business assignment that nobody else wanted. A lot of reporters don't like math and don't like anything that has numbers in it, and so that was kind of a not so much, it wasn't that I was particularly good, it was just no one else was, the competition was spare. There was not a lot, it was an easy league to play in, an easy bracket. And so I became a business reporter, and as I told some journalism students this afternoon, in 2003, the governor of Vermont was getting a lot of press for this kind of upstart presidential campaign that involved a lot of internet. He was getting a lot of support via the internet, which was at that time still a fairly novel political organizing tool. And I just dashed off a note to one of my editors saying, this reminds me of this book I read about Father Coughlin in the 30s, who had a huge radio audience but was never really able to translate it into active political support, even though he had millions of followers on the radio, because listening to the radio just isn't the same as real shoe leather political organizing. I said, you know, I don't know if the parallel's exact, but maybe this internet organizing isn't going to have sticking power either. And I don't know, this Howard Dean might turn out to be a flash in the pan. We'll see. And you ought to have one of your political reporters look at that. And this is a lesson. Don't ever write a memo like that unless you are prepared to have the editor say, yeah, why don't you go look at that? So I began covering who everybody thought was going to be the Democratic nominee in the 2004 election, which was Howard Dean. Of course, he wasn't. Even before the Iowa scream, he had begun to fade. And this senator who everyone had written off, John Kerry, wins the Iowa caucuses, wins the New Hampshire primary, runs the table, becomes the nominee, and they said, okay, why don't you follow John Kerry around for the rest of the year? So I wound up doing that. Then I went back to being a business reporter, went back to my regular day job, covered the hockey strike, stuff like that. And 4 years later, they said, hey, another New England governor looks like he's going to be the Republican nominee for president. You ought to start learning about Mitt Romney. So I spent 6 months reading Mitt Romney's first book. I mean, not the whole 6 months. I mean, it didn't take that long, but it was a period of time I'll never get back. And of course, he didn't turn out to be the nominee that time, and instead a senator who everyone had written off, John McCain, comes out of nowhere, performs well and performs better than expected early on, and then goes to run the table on Super Tuesday, becomes the nominee, and I wind up covering John McCain. So on the strength of that, they said, well, we'd like you to come back and cover the White House, which I did for the first term. And the question then was, are they going to have me cover Obama's re-election campaign, or are they going to have me cover the Republican challenger? Because by this time, the Horsley curse is pretty well established, right? I mean, I'd covered Howard Dean, John Kerry, Romney Incarnation 1, and John McCain, none of whom wound up in the White House. So the bosses at NPR said, we're going to have you cover Obama, we're going to have your colleague Ari Shapiro cover the Republican challenger. And I thought, oh, that's it for Obama, one-termer. And it's a testament to his skill as a campaigner and his crack staff that he weathered the Horsley curse. And forget 8% unemployment, he managed to win re-election even with me on his tail.
Talk a little bit about those three individuals and their campaigns you spent so much time with. Just give us some observations. What were they like to be around? How well organized were the campaigns? The attitude of the campaign toward media, those kinds of things.
Well, John Kerry's campaign, had come back from the grave. He had literally mortgaged his house in order to keep body and soul together. So he did not have a big campaign apparatus when he won Iowa and New Hampshire. But pretty quickly, the Democratic establishment rallied around him, and he had all the Kennedy machinery and his own Senate experience and so forth. So he had a pretty professional campaign, and some of the old Clinton band came back together and helped out. He was a reasonably effective campaigner, but I often would have the experience of going into a union hall or a airplane hangar where the loud Springsteen music was blasting out and everyone was really excited, and then Senator Kerry would get up to start to speak. And kind of all the air would go out of the room. And with John McCain, he was really given up for dead. I mean, he was lugging his own suit bag on Southwest up to New Hampshire to campaign. He was really operating on a shoestring. And even after he started to show renewed life, it wasn't as if the whole Republican establishment rallied around him. He was on a shoestring right through Super Tuesday. But of course, his strength was he loved talking to reporters, and reporters loved talking to him. He was the un-Kerry. As guarded as Kerry was, that's how open John McCain was. And of course, that had been how he'd almost seized the brass ring in 2000, and he was kind of trying to have that happen again in 2007 and 2008. And I remember we had a cross-country flight one time from somewhere on the East Coast out to California. They had 2 press conferences during the course of the flight. You know, they had a press conference, answered all of our questions. The candidate went back to the front of the plane. We all started writing our stories. We fly for another hour. He comes back. Anybody got some other questions? Like, we're still in the plane. What could we have any questions about? None of us had, phones didn't work up there. We didn't have internet access. What could we possibly ask about? So he was, access to the point of toxicity, which was great, but also a little bit painful. It's because you'd say at some point, I've got to write my story. You know, would you go sit down, stop talking, let me write my story? And finally, in the sort of the summer of '08, as he's the nominee now, Steve Schmidt put the kibosh on that and said, Senator, you can't just roam around in this Winnebago with the reporters in the back. You know, you look like Grandpa in the captain's chair. And, you know, some reporter would ask a Viagra question, and that would torpedo whatever the message of the day was. And so all of a sudden, they try to turn the McCain campaign into this very buttoned-down, traditional presidential campaign. And access went out the window, and then Sarah Palin arrived, and all of a sudden the rallies got enormously lively. I mean, so that was an amazing phenomenon, the early days of the Sarah Palin effect, because McCain's rallies were never real boisterous until she showed up. And then covering Obama was, like covering a rock star. It was not the same as covering it in 2008. I spent a little bit of time with Obama in his first go-round. That was really like a rock star. But even though the bloom was a little off the rose, in his re-election bid, it was like being a roadie with the Rolling Stones or something. And the rallies were always boisterous and exciting. The candidate was rarely accessible. We rarely saw the candidate. It was a very controlled, very tightly orchestrated campaign, but very professional, very professional.
Mm-hmm. A lot of people, I think, feel that traveling around with the president all the time is a real glamorous role, but covering a campaign is a real grind, isn't it?
Yes, it definitely is. It's long days and nights of travel, although less so with Obama than it had been in my earlier campaigns. I mean, my earlier 2 campaigns, those guys didn't have anything else to do, so they would just campaign for weeks at a time, especially John Kerry. He campaigned nonstop from January through November of 2004. John McCain, once he locked up the nomination, took some time off, but in the end, he was campaigning nonstop. President Obama still had to go home and be president, part-time at least, And also, Mitt Romney didn't campaign that much this time around, so it was not as intense. But it's a grind. It's a lot of travel. It's a lot of time away from home. And in the sort of end game, that's okay because you are the story. You're on the news every night, every morning. And if you're going to be working hard, it's okay if you're on the radio all the time. The really tough time is when you're spending a long time away from home and working hard in April. And nobody cares. Nobody's paying attention to the race. That's when it's tough.
Mm-hmm. What are the principal differences from a coverage point of view, from your job in covering a primary versus a general election campaign?
Well, early on when you're covering a primary, you really do have shoppers. When you go to a town hall meeting, you really talk to people who are making up their minds, and you can and they're literally still undecided voters. In the later even by the later primary, that's less true. But certainly by the time you get to the general election, there are not a lot of shoppers, and we saw this. This was reflected in the polling, but it was also reflected in my experience in talking to people. I mean, if we had ended the campaign 6 months before we did, I'm not sure the result would have been dramatically different. I don't know very many people changed their mind in the last 6 months of the campaign. Even after the Denver debate, when there was a pretty good swing in the polls, what the Obama people have said after the fact, and you can take this with a grain of salt, I suppose, but I think it's not entirely self-serving. The people who tilted away, they're convinced that the people who tilted away from them after the first Denver debate were never really in their camp to start with. They didn't lose their solid supporters after Denver. The people they lost were maybe the floaters who were really turned off by Romney's 47% remark or something. They got kind of an artificial high after their own convention, after the Democratic convention, and they lost those people. But it kind of went back to where they thought it would be all along. So by the time you're covering the general election, the electorate's minds are largely made up, and it takes something like the 47% or the Denver debate to even move the needle just a little bit. Whereas early on, these are often sort of unknown quantities to a lot of voters, and they're discovering them as you are. And when you tell stories about the candidates, people are, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. I didn't know that John McCain, aside from spending all that time in a POW camp, also commanded this squadron for a time. And what can that tell us about his leadership abilities? Or, I didn't know that Obama had worked in the financial world for a little while. So you're still actually telling new things to people.
Mm-hmm. How do campaigns try to manipulate correspondents and reporters into covering their campaign more fairly?
They don't want us to cover them fairly. That's not their interest. They want us to cover them favorably. That fairness is never their goal. It's like the U.S. military says. We try to avoid a fair fight. we try to fight on our terms. That's what campaigns try to do. But look, manipulation maybe sounds more sleazy than it is. But every day the campaign puts on a show. And I don't mean that it's a fiction, but it's a show. It's a demonstration of some message that they want to get across. And we can cover that message. We can cover that message and provide some context. Or we can ignore that message altogether and cover something completely. We can do the Viagra story instead of whatever John McCain wanted to talk about that day. But every day they put on a show. And the better they are at putting on a show, finding a show that's compelling, telling a story that's newsworthy, the more successful they are at projecting their message, at controlling the message. But of course, even the best campaign gets curveballs thrown at it. A candidate himself goes off message, which Romney did frequently, but Obama did it too occasionally. The private sector is doing fine. You might remember that. In 08, when McCain said the fundamentals of the economy are sound, when he was the only person in America that thought the fundamentals of the economy were sound. You know, a cannon can go off message. Bin Laden can send a videotape, which happened to Kerry in the waning days of the 04 campaign. I mean, even the most well-orchestrated, well-scripted campaign is subject to events beyond their control.
There must be long periods of time when you're covering a campaign when you're bored stiff. What do you do to entertain yourself?
Sleep. Try to catch a cat nap whenever possible. Well, all three of my campaigns, I kept a diary. And so I would often use that momentary lapses to kind of catch up on writing up what had happened during the more exciting time from the 3 or 4 days before, or something like that. Some people drink. I did occasionally, not too often. I'm not as young as a lot of the people that cover the campaigns. It's funny, you know, when I covered the Kerry campaign, I was sort of in the middle of the age range of the correspondents doing it. And as I got older, the people covering the campaigns kept getting younger. Like now they have 4th graders covering the campaign. And we'd pull into the hotel at 11 o'clock at night, and all I'd want to know is, you know, where's the bed? And they'd say, where's the bar? And maybe not even the hotel bar. Maybe where's the bar down the street? But yeah, there's certainly, yeah, it is long periods of tedium interrupted by moments of transcendent excitement, for sure. And you don't ever know for sure which you're going to be in. So you kind of have to, you can't check out completely. You have to at least keep one eye open for the possibility that news is going to happen, or something interesting is going to happen. Might not be news, but might be something worth remembering.
I realize there's no such thing as an average day in a campaign, but what was a typical day like for you? I mean, when did you have to get up? When did you have to have your luggage out? All those kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, as I say, with Obama, it was you know, we didn't do a lot of extended trips until pretty late in the game, till August, September, October, by which time you sort of expect to be in full bore mode. Jay mentioned my dogs, Rufus and Rosie. So I have my dog sitter who stays with him when I'm on the road is a very important person in my life. And you know, I had sort of told the dog sitter, okay, I don't know how much time I'm going to need you, but August, September, and October I could be on the road nonstop, and maybe before then. And really only in the last bit of the campaign were we really traveling all the time. But it varied with the candidates. You know, McCain was not an early riser, so we didn't usually start that early. Obama's definitely not an early riser. Some of it has to do with the time zone you're in. They would try to stretch the day, start on the East Coast, work their way west, sometimes then zip back to the East Coast to start all over again the next day. But it was not terribly inhumane. I mean, the earliest you might start would be a 5 or 6 a.m. load-up time, but often you wouldn't load till 7 or 8, and you'd be on a bus or a van or sometimes a plane. It seems to me McCain always liked to fly someplace first thing in the morning. He would sleep in the city where his last event was and then fly someplace else the first thing in the morning. Obama would prefer to have a late event, then fly to the next place he was going to be, start the next day. Obama always works out in the morning, so that would buy you some time. You could sleep or work out yourself while he was working out, unless you're in the pool, which was every day a small group of reporters, a subset of reporters has to tag along with the president everywhere he goes, and that rotates. So every 3rd, 4th day maybe you'd be in the pool. And if you were in the pool, you had to go to the gym with him. You didn't get to exercise. You'd just sit in the van outside while he exercised. So if you were in the pool, you didn't get to exercise. If you were not in the pool, you could stay back at the hotel and exercise. Actually, it's kind of, oftentimes the president wouldn't exercise in the hotel gym. I don't know quite what it had something to do, I don't think it had to do with the equipment that was in the gym. It had to do with the Secret Service would case the gym or whatever, and some gyms they'd let him work out in, sometimes they'd go off-site to another gym. occasionally he would work out in the hotel gym. And I can't remember where we were, but I was not in the pool that day, so I was down on the treadmill doing my little, trying to work off the big dinner they gave us the night before. And I leave, and as I'm going out, Hans Nichols from Bloomberg is coming in. And he said, I saw him later, he says, oh yeah, after you left, Horsley, the president came in, was working out in the gym. So, you know, Hans got to ask the president a couple questions while he's working out. So the next time we're that the president's going to work out in the hotel gym, I'm down there on the treadmill, and I see these Secret Service guys come in. I'm like, oh, I guess the president's going to come in. So I kind of I'm not going to leave this time. I keep working out, And I usually run on about half an hour on the treadmill. Well, now it's 45 minutes. He hasn't come in yet. I go another 15. I'm dying. I give up. He's not coming in. So I leave. Sure enough, he comes in after I leave. So finally, we're in Charlotte at the convention. And I'm down there in the gym. And no Secret Service even come in this time. But the president himself walks in and starts doing his workout. So I never even got an early warning sign that time. It so happened that the next day I was going to take a break. I'd been out for 10 days or something like that, and so I was going to go home. My colleague Don Gagne replaces me. Now, Don and I don't really look very much alike, but we both have, I say salt and pepper, some people say silver hair. We both wear glasses. You know, we're both these gray-haired white guys from NPR, I guess. And so that night they had a little dinner for the press corps, and the president goes over to Gagne and says, hey, I saw you in the hotel gym yesterday. And luckily, Don immediately recognizes what's going on and just plays along with it. And he thinks, how much small talk is he going to make? He says, the president kept asking me about my workout routine. So he just rode with it.
Oh, that's a great one. Timothy
Carl Castle always gets us mixed up too. Whenever Carl sees me in the hallway, he says, "Hi, Don." And what can you do? I mean, it's Carl Castle. You're not going to say, "Carl, it's Scott." You know, you just nod, say, "Hi, Carl."
Timothy Krause wrote "Boys on the Bus" about covering the '72 presidential campaign. You've obviously read it. Most of us who have a real interest in politics have. How, you know, having read that and now having done 3 of these, how have campaigns changed, coverage of campaigns changed, and how has coverage remained the same?
Yeah, I think I read that maybe when I was in college or something, and when I took the assignment to cover the '04 campaign, of course I asked all kinds of people how I should prepare, what I should bone up on, and people told me I should read that if I hadn't read it already, so I reread it. And of course it's a great story. And there's another story, it's kind of a follow-on that David Foster Wallace wrote about the 2000 John McCain campaign for Rolling Stone, which is kind of an updated version of the Boys on the Bus was adapted from a Rolling Stone piece that Krause had done. And David Foster Wallace's piece about the McCain campaign was sort of the, 28-year anniversary remake. It's amazing how little has changed in terms of what you do, and yet the technology has changed dramatically. And that's even in the 8 years I was doing it, I was the first person at NPR to get an air card to slip into my laptop that allowed me to get internet access when I wasn't tethered to anything, wireless internet access on the road. And I got it partly because I was doing the campaign, but also because I lived in San Diego, which was the home of Qualcomm and was kind of an early test market for it. And in the early days, it didn't work very many places. It worked in a lot of big cities, but it would frequently not work. And it didn't work very fast anywhere. But at least at some point, you might get to where you could send email, but also you could transmit sound over the thing. And it was a revelation to my colleagues when I could send a news spot from a moving press bus in the middle of Wisconsin. And that, in 2004, that was a novelty. Of course, by 2008, it was old hat. And by 2012, it was like, hey, why have you only filed 5 spots from the moving bus? So as the technology has gotten easier to file more frequently, the expectations have ratcheted up that you're now supposed to be filing constantly. And in the Timothy Krause book, the reporters would go to an event, and then they would write their stories on a portable typewriter, and somebody would come around and gather up the copy, the paper copy, and they'd take it to Western Union or something and send it back. And then once the copy was out of the reporter's hands, they were kind of done, right, until the next event. And that meant they could think, and they could look around, and they could talk to each other. And that's all gone now. Now you're constantly wired. So on the one hand, it's great because you can talk to your editors all the time, you can talk to your family all the time, you can talk to your dog sitter. On the other hand, it's terrible because you can talk to your editors all the time, you can talk to your family all the time. One reporter was planning her wedding all during the campaign. The whole bus knew all about her wedding plans. But so it's great that we're more connected, but we've lost a lot of the reflection, which is true of so much of the media. And then I mentioned how everybody's getting younger. I mean, in Timothy Krause's book, it's David Broder who's doing that. He's the guy typing away, and Johnny Apple and the stars of political reporting. Now it's me. I mean, and a bunch of fourth graders. And the stars of political reporting sit back in New York and take all this input and write their books or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Tell us your favorite story or 2 stories from the campaign trail.
Well, this has 0 political significance, but it was just kind of fun. We were at one point, the president we had stopped at the West Side Market in Cleveland, which is a big covered market, like a farmer's market, but under a permanent cover, and has lots of little stalls and shops and so forth. And he'd gone to Michelle's Bakery, because Michelle caught his eye, and he bought some zucchini bread, and that kind of caught my attention because my mom always makes zucchini bread. And so I was joking. I told some of us, I didn't know the president likes zucchini bread. Next time I'll get some of my mom's zucchini bread. And they say, yeah, fine, Scott. So a few weeks later, we were on one of these coast-to-coast marathons. We did a couple of these, but this one, it was like 36 or 48 hours straight or something, where we hit 5 or 6 states, no sleep, lots of coffee, 5,000 miles on the airplane or something like that. And one of the stops was in Denver, my hometown. And my mom had never been to any kind of political rally, as far as I know, certainly never to a presidential political rally. And this was getting kind of late in the campaign. I said, well, why don't you come to the rally when we come to Denver? I don't know if I'll be able to peel away, but maybe I can at least say hi. And you should see it. It's historic. Who knows how many times you'll have to see President Obama again. And so she and some of her buddies came. It was in City Park, the big park in central Denver, and she brought a zucchini bread, a homemade zucchini bread. And when you go to this rally, you have to go through an airport-style metal detector. And I don't know. They didn't say anything. I guess no law against bringing a zucchini bread. You can't bring signs. You can't bring scissors, but you can bring zucchini bread. And I guess when she was going through the metal detector or something, she happened to take the paper ticket that she had. You could go down to your Democratic office, or I don't know how they got the tickets. They pass out tickets before you go in. So she tucked the ticket in the bag with the zucchini bread. And so we were on the cell phone, of course, because you got the cell phone now. You can stay in contact. So she's calling me I'm on the bus coming over the rally site. We've just landed. She said, we're here. We're standing over by the big flag. Great. There's only 700 big flags. That doesn't really narrow it down. But somehow in this sea of 10,000 people, I find her, and she gives me the zucchini bread. So I tuck it in my bag. And the rally happens, and we go off, and we go on to Las Vegas and somewhere in New Mexico, and we're heading back to the East Coast now, and we're 30 hours into our 48-hour cross-country marathon, and I decided I'm going to break out the zucchini bread, serve it to the press corps there in the back of the plane, and I slice it up, and just then the president comes back into the press cabin, which he doesn't do very often, and I said, "Oh, Mr. President, I know you like zucchini bread. Would you like some of my mom's homemade zucchini bread?" And he, somewhat to my surprise, takes a piece and has it. And he says, "Oh, this is great. I got to send your mom a note." So I happened to have the ticket that she had tucked in the bag with the zucchini bread. So I just gave him the note, the ticket, and he wrote, "Dear Mimi, great zucchini bread, Barack Obama." So I tucked that back in my pocket, and she says, "Well, was the zucchini bread done?" Because she's always worried that it's going to be kind of runny on the inside. I said, "No, but it was great. It was great zucchini bread." So I took a picture of the ticket with the signature, and I picked like the last piece of zucchini bread before some of the photographers probably took it, I guess, and sent it off to her. And, as I say, zero political significance, but it was it was kind of fun. And then the night before election night, the last night of the campaign, the Monday before Election Tuesday, Obama had his last rally in Des Moines, which, of course, had been kind of the scene of his first big win in the Iowa caucuses in 2008. And they had kind of been talking it up all the way, oh, it's going to be great. We're going to have a great rally, an outdoor rally in downtown Des Moines. Bruce Springsteen's going to play. It's going to be great. And kind of, as I say, every day they try to put on a show. Their shtick this day was it's going to be really sentimental because this is where it all began for Barack Obama. And we're all kind of, jaded reporters are all, yeah, it's where it all began. Great, I mean, I think he genuinely had. We all knew that he liked Iowa. He'd spent a lot of time there, campaigning 4 years ago. But anyway, it was a beautiful night. It was a great, crisp, cold, clear fall night in Iowa, right in downtown Des Moines. It's outside the original headquarters of the Obama campaign there from 4 years earlier. Huge crowd, of course. Bruce Springsteen plays. I'm a big Springsteen fan, so that was fun. And it was one of those events that actually kind of lived up to its cinematic build-up. They had kind of described it the way you could imagine, like the movie director, and you'd sort of think, oh, that's going to be really hokey, but it wasn't. It was very nice, and I say that not in a partisan way, because I've covered both Republicans and Democrats, and always at the end of the campaign, whether you're a winning candidate or a losing candidate, there's something about those sort of last frantic days, and even if you're even if you're going to lose pretty big, you still get big crowds. I mean, there's still not quite half the country's on your side, and they'll come out, and it's kind of inspiring to see that kind of turnout, especially on a cold night. People standing there, wrapped up in blankets, often with their little kids. They bring their little kids, to see history in the making, and as I say, this happened to be one that really lived up to its sort of sentimental billing.
Those never get old, do they?
No, and even having done it 3 times, and as exhausted as you are by that point in the campaign, you sort of say, wow, that's pretty special. And I remember John Kerry said in his concession speech, which of course came a day late because we all had to stay up so late. But he says, nobody loses on Election Day in America because we all wake up and we are Americans. And as cynical as we get as political reporters, it's a pretty impressive sight that once every 4 years that's how we choose our leaders, and it's kind of a wondrous thing to have a front row seat to watch, or not really a front row seat. I always say I'm really kind of in the back underneath the camera risers, peeking out through somebody's legs, but nevertheless, a seat, a witness, to bear witness to it.
Okay. I have one more question, then we're going to open it up to your questions and answers. But take a few minutes to describe the difference between being a correspondent or a reporter on a campaign and working at the White House, being the White House correspondent?
It's funny. I got to ask a lot of the Obama staffers about this because a lot of people who had worked on the first campaign, then came and worked in the White House, a lot of them left the White House to go back and work on the second campaign. And I would ask them, what's the difference? And they would say, in a campaign, it's very black and white. The goal is very well defined. And every day they'd say, I have a very clear mission. I get up every morning and my job is to do something that's going to help the president get 271 electoral votes. And if what I'm doing doesn't contribute to that, then I shouldn't be doing it. And so they have a very focused idea of what they need to do, and it's a real tunnel vision, which is very limiting, but also very clarifying. And that's almost completely different at the White House. I mean, there's nothing at the White House that is that tunnel vision. There's nothing that is that black and white. There's nothing that's that well defined. And for a lot of people, that can be very frustrating. And so a lot of the staffers would say, I love my time at the White House, but I'm so glad to be back where I actually know what I need to do every day. And as a correspondent, of course, it's distinct and says it's never my job to advance whatever their agenda is, but I certainly understand that the complexity that makes it more frustrating for the staffers, but from my point of view, it's also much more interesting. I mean, those shades of gray, especially for those of us in public radio, we love the shades of gray, right? That's what we do for minute 2 through 5 in the story. The first minute's the black and white. Minute 2, 3, 4 are the shades of gray and all the complicating factors, and why whether you say yes to the Keystone Pipeline is not as simple as are you going to lose the union vote in Ohio or win the environmental vote in Colorado. It's a more complicated question than that. And as the president himself has said, there are no simple questions when you're sitting in the Oval Office. If the question was simple, somebody way down the food chain would have answered it. If it got to his desk, it's because it's a complicated question, and somebody's going to be unhappy with the answer. But if you're writing about it, that makes it much more interesting.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's open it up to your questions and answers. We have Kristen and Evan, who are both have mics, so you want to get their attention, they'll bring a mic by.
Scott, could you talk a little bit about what correlation, if there is any, between poll results and how things actually turn out to be? During these campaigns, we hear polls all the time. Seems like a campaign can always find a poll to say whatever it is they want to say. So how do you, as a reporter, filter out which polls to pay attention to and how to tell whether or not the results you're seeing has any significance? Yeah.
Well, this campaign was very interesting in that respect because it was almost like there were two universes of polls. At NPR, we used to have a guy whose whole job was to analyze polls for us and to tell us what were the polls we could trust and what were the ones that had a lot of methodological shortcomings and so forth. I think in 2009, with some budget cutbacks, we lost that position, so we don't have anybody do that anymore. But, you know, Nate Silver performed pretty well in this last go-around, and his philosophy is just aggregate all the polls. You know, the flaws will cancel each other out, and add them all up, and he had some secret sauce in the way he added them all up, and it's pretty hard to argue with his results. Obviously, there was a lot of teeth gnashing on the Romney camp in the end, and they professed to at least be flabbergasted at the results, and I was flabbergasted that they were flabbergasted because any objective reading of the polls a few days out or even a month out from Election Day showed the president ahead or tied in more than enough states to win the election. So unless the polls were wrong, it looked as if he was going to win. and it turned out the polls were right. At least the aggregates of the polls were right. So I still am not entirely sure what they were smoking in the Romney camp, but theirs were pretty far off. In fact, we were joking. We had this the storm that hit y'all, or maybe it was a different storm, but we were all bracing in Washington for a big snowstorm last week. They closed the federal government. Every school in the district was closed. We got about 1/8 of an inch of snow, and then it turned to rain. And I said it was the worst forecast since Romney's pollster. It was, that was just malpractice. Obviously, in any campaign, for morale purposes, there's something to be said for hoping for the best. But as the Obama camp said, you don't do a poll to make yourself feel good. You do a poll to find out what the world looks like, and they seem to be, at least the polls that they were reporting, seem to be polls that were designed to make them feel good, as opposed to what the world looked like.
Okay, we have a question back here.
Scott, in your role as White House correspondent, you've watched a lot of years of congressional back and forthing go on. I'm pretty discouraged when I watch the impasse that's developed nowadays between the houses of Congress and their inability to get off the ground zero and move towards good conclusions. Can you offer some of your insights there and perhaps a ray of hope for the future?
Which would you like, the insights or the ray of hope? No, hope springs eternal, and there are certainly some encouraging signs. I mean, one of the things that Obama said in the waning days of the campaign was, and I think he sincerely believed this, he said, look, if I get reelected with unemployment as high as it is, the Republicans are going to have to do some soul searching. They're going to have to say, how do we lose in this environment when the race was winnable? At least, if you subscribe to the old theory that if the unemployment that high, the president's going to be pretty vulnerable. And he's counting on that soul searching on their part to help him make some progress on his agenda items, in particular the fiscal items, and also after Newtown the gun control items, and certainly immigration. In terms of immigration, I think you're absolutely seeing, if not soul searching, at least instinct for survival moving Republicans. But I've yet to see a lot of soul searching on fiscal matters, and in fact, the budget that came out from the House Republicans today is it's like, gosh, didn't we have an election in November? That said, the House Republicans, their argument is, yeah, well, we all won too, and there's a certain logic to that, and so in that sense, I'm not sure I have a whole lot to offer in terms of hope that they're going to reach some kind of compromise. It's still a very divided Congress, and that's reflective of nothing other than a very divided country.
Okay, I have a question right here.
In the same vein, maybe redundant, last week you ended a report on the events at the White House, with the president scheduling dinners both at the White House and at restaurants in Washington, D.C., with senators and other legislators. And you ended up the report saying, in the long run, the president is going to have to find some senators who will be willing to do more with him than go out to dinner. Are there any? Is there anything possible in that realm?
Thanks for listening. Well, and that the dinner that he had with the dozen senators, I think, was probably more encouraging than the lunch that he had with Congressman Ryan. I mean, I think in the Senate, I think it's easier to make. And when I say progress, I don't mean to say I'm endorsing that goal, but it just progress in terms of reaching some compromise without regard to, whether it's where they ought to end up or not. But in the Senate, it's easier to get to some compromise because senators have to run statewide, and that means they're a little bit more subject to say the election results of November, there are certainly some senators on that list of 12 who can count and kind of know where the writing is. That's less true on the House, where those House members just have to run in their own districts, and most of them are pretty safe, and they're more worried about obviously a challenge from the right in the Republican primary than they are losing in a general election. So yeah, among those dozen senators, I remember in the summer of 2011, there were 40+ senators who were willing to adopt the Gang of Six proposal, which was to the left, or called for more taxes than what the president's calling for now. Not a majority, but 40+ senators, which is enough to at least get you talking. Get to stop a filibuster. I'm not sure what they can do on the House unless John Boehner's willing to bring something to the floor again with without a majority of his own membership, and you can't do that too many times, or you might find yourself not being Speaker anymore. I was in the camp that was surprised when the president didn't drive a harder bargain at the first of the year over the fiscal cliff. I said there was never going to be another opportunity like that when the president could get, not because of Republican largesse, but because the deck was stacked in his favor, that even if the Republicans didn't want anything, he was going to get all the tax revenue he'd ever want. He didn't push that hard, and at the time the White House defended that by saying, well, we're going to get more tax revenue in some future round, and if they do, that'll prove to have been a masterstroke. If they don't, there's going to be a lot of second guessing, and we'll see how that goes. They did get other things in the fiscal cliff deal. They got an extension of some tax breaks for the poor that were very important. They got an extension of unemployment benefits, and they would not have gotten either of those things through default the way they would have gotten the tax revenue. So that that is worth considering, and it was big in their calculus. But that deal will look a lot better for the president if he is successful as he projected he would be in getting more revenue in some future round, and it'll look less good if he doesn't manage to strike that bargain.
Okay. We have a question in the back.
This is a very quick two-parter here. On the brief amount of time that candidates actually do get to entertain themselves or with others on the campaign tour, how do they do so? And secondarily, do you ever suspect that we will see a very moderate Republican candidate such as Alan Alda played on the West Wing series anytime soon?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of your question. You're asking how do the candidates entertain themselves, or how do the
candidates entertain themselves in the scant amount of time they have to do so on
when they're campaigning?
Campaigns? Yeah.
Well, whatever they did it out of my sight. I can't imagine a worse way to spend a summer, really. Aside from what I said about how moving it is to be in the crowd of 10,000 thinking about the future of the country, to spend a hot summer traipsing across the Midwest, standing outside addressing crowds one after another, does not strike me as my idea of an ideal summer. I remember somebody saying, especially during the Kerry campaign, Teresa Heinz Kerry had all the money in the world. Couldn't she think of something better to do with her fortune than, I'll be in the south of France, John. Call me in November, and we'll see how it goes. But as far as the other, I think that's the kind of soul searching that the president was talking about. After the Democrats took a drubbing in 1988, which was sort of the latest in a series of drubbings, they did some soul searching, and that's what produced a centrist Democrat like Bill Clinton. And that's I think what the Democrats would like to see happen in the Republican Party. I haven't seen any evidence of it happening thus far, but it's also true that trying to make a projection at this point in the game of what's going to happen in 2016 or 2020 is a fool's errand. I mean, I was saying earlier that I certainly remember well in 1991 when no serious Democrat wanted to challenge the first President Bush, because after the first Gulf War, I mean, nobody's going to beat him, so all the serious candidates just bided their time, and you know, the sort of second tier came out, and of course that prediction turned out to be about as good as Romney's about what was going to happen. So, you know, who knows? Maybe we'll be seeing a northeastern moderate, maybe not pro-choice, but not virulently anti-abortion Republican who favors immigration rights in 2016 or 2020. Maybe not. I don't know. We'll see.
I simply cannot recall the level of intransience that I'm seeing now between our two political parties. And for the life of me, I can't figure out quite how it's gotten this bad. Have you got any ideas?
Yeah, I don't necessarily recall it either, although readings of long history do show that there have been worse periods in our country's past. You know, there was it's funny, the president talks a lot about Lincoln, and he often says that even in the middle of the Civil War, he was still able to build the Transcontinental Railroad, still able to endow the land-grant colleges. And he always presents this as if, you know, even in the midst of this war, he managed to turn his attention to these other agenda items. And there was a fascinating book out this last year, Land of Promise, I think is the title, that makes the point. It wasn't despite the Civil War. It was because of the Civil War. All the Southern lawmakers who had for years opposed those projects were suddenly no longer in the Congress. They were meeting elsewhere. And suddenly, Lincoln had the freedom to pursue these sort of big Hamiltonian projects that had been stifled for years by the landed gentry in the South and their representatives in Congress. So you know, this conception of the government's role in the economy, which is, I think, at the heart of what we're really fighting over now, is as old as the Republic, and we've seen even bigger divisions in the past than we're seeing now. But that's not to say I'm encouraged by the level of camaraderie in Washington. You know, I think the president argued when he was here in Osawatomie and later in the campaign, you know, that throughout the post-war period, we had a sort of bipartisan consensus in this country, from Eisenhower's interstate highways to Nixon's EPA, of a fairly robust role for the federal government in the economy and in environmental regulation and in lots of ways, which the president calls the post-war consensus, and that consensus is nowhere to be found right now. And I don't know if I don't see any immediate prospect that we're going to find it again. But like I say, it's not as if this is the only period in our history when that consensus is broken down. Okay, and hopefully we can find it without having to, you know, exclude a whole bunch of former Confederate states.
I have a question in the back.
Yes, I was wondering, in regards to constituents and citizens, if you had a formula for like an authenticity litmus test that we could discriminate when we're being snowed and when we're being not. The example I have is President Reagan passes legislation against the working man, and that night he's in a bar hoisting bruisies and buying booze for some guys in construction hats. And it's not that I feel like a patsy, but sometimes I want to know that I hunger for the truth, and I hunger for substantial discerning litmus tests that kind of make sense. And sometimes I feel like, you know, I'm being invited down the hole with the Mad Hatter to have tea.
Well, it's a good question, and it sounds like you're doing a pretty good job of seeing through bullshit, but my worry, I am a little bit wary. I don't know, how do people in this room feel about the book What's Wrong with Kansas? Or what's the matter with Kansas? What's wrong with Kansas?
What's the matter?
What's the matter with Kansas? Because I think that's kind of Frank's argument, right, is that a lot of working class people have been snowed under or distracted by social issues or other concerns and aren't voting their economic interests. And implicit in that is the author's suggestion that he understands not only their economic interests but their whole political interests better than they do. And I'm hesitant to put myself in that position and say, I know better than someone who falls for that, say, social conservative line when they should be voting based on marginal tax rates or something like that. I guess in a democracy, for better or worse, everybody has to make his or her own decision about where their interests lie, and everyone has to make his or her own judgment of who's authentic and who speaks to them. And certainly I agree. I have found myself sharing the same skepticism you do. Why is anybody listening to this bozo who's obviously just chilling for X, Y, or Z and is not, truly representing the people who seem to be flocking to him? But I'm hesitant to tell any voter I know what's best for them better than they do.
Okay, we're going to take a few more questions. We have one right here.
Mine's a two-part question involving the same individual. How important was President Clinton's appearance at the convention? And then would you care to comment on or compare Clinton's campaigns with Obama's campaigns?
Well, I can't really compare the campaigns because I covered, when Bill Clinton was running for office, I was a local reporter in Tampa, Florida. I saw him on the stump a few times, and he was a good campaigner. Of course, he had his own moments when he said something he shouldn't have and paid a price for it. And of course, he had some other mistakes along the way as well. But I think, there are second acts in America, aren't there? I mean, boy, talk about a second act or a third act. There's no question he wowed the crowd in Charlotte. His speech was way better than the president's speech. I think the president himself would probably acknowledge that. Right after the convention, they went out campaigning together, and I remember the president joking that some kid had come up to him and said, "You ought to make Bill Clinton your secretary of explaining stuff." And it's not a bad idea, right? I mean, again, I'm not sure if we'd had the election in May that the results would have been dramatically different. So I don't want to suggest that anything turned the tide, but it certainly didn't hurt. It was a tour de force speech. I mean, it reminded people who liked Bill Clinton what they liked about him.
Okay.
Thank you for coming, Mr. Horsley. My question is, in this, like in the political climate like we have today, do you feel like in your experience covering politics that when there's a great amount of polarization in terms of the two parties and people that belong to the two parties that we have more positive socioeconomic change, or is it like during the Clinton administration, or was that just a complete fluke where when there's very literal polarization that we have more positive socioeconomic change?
Well, again, I wasn't covering politics during the Clinton administration, but even though in hindsight it seems like Congress sometimes agreed more, let's not forget they did impeach the president. And we did shut the government down for long periods of time. So I don't think we were free of polarization during that 8-year span. There's no question we had, that was a terrific period for the economy. And first First President Bush deserves some credit for that too. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure there's a strong correlation between political polarization and economic gains. I think the political paralysis in Washington right now is harmful to the economy. I don't think there's much question about that. But I'm not sure that we can credit the relatively robust growth that we saw in the 90s to some sort of kumbaya period in Washington, because people who were there at the time, and I wasn't, but people who remember that say that they had a lot of fights in those days too.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions.
Could you reflect a bit on the recent flap or the press corps with respect to Obama and his golf game? Because there was quite a flap about.
Yeah. For those of you who aren't have lives, the president took a long weekend down in Florida to play golf, and some of my brethren in the media who flew down there were mad because they were kind of kept on the outskirts of the golf course and didn't get to watch him play or take pictures of him playing. More in the point, I suppose. And it became a particularly grating when he played with Tiger Woods, who has some news baggage of his own. You know, the president plays golf most weekends, or many weekends in the summertime, or when the weather's nice in Washington, and we typically don't get to film him. And that was true, I think, when Eisenhower played golf too. So that's not really new. I think what some people found objectionable about this was when the president plays in Washington, he usually plays out at Andrews Air Force Base, and there's really nobody else around. It's the president and his foursome, and they go play golf. And here he was playing at a sort of a semi-private club, and I think the developer of the club and some people who own houses of the club are major donors of the president, and it's not open to the public, but there are people who are there along with him that we don't know, and that always makes reporters nervous. Like, what kind of fat cats is the president talking to, and what they're talking about, and even that would probably have been tolerable, except that there was a reporter from the Golf Channel who was somehow inside, and that was really galling to the media, because there they are on the outside being frozen out, and here's this guy from the Golf Channel who's like describing the lessons that the president's getting from Tiger's old golf coach. And I guess I should, if I have my press card in my wallet, I should swear that this is an affront to the First Amendment and demand that we be allowed in to watch the president play golf, but I just can't bring myself to get exercised about this. I mean, there are lots of things, there are lots of rooms that I'd like to be allowed into, there are lots of conversations I'd like to overhear, but I'd rather have sat at the table at the Jefferson Hotel and heard what John McCain and Lindsey Graham and Tom Coburn and the president said about the budget than what Tiger Woods said to the president. I just can't bring myself to care. And maybe if I was a golfer, I would care more. But
okay, we're going to take one last question.
I get to be the last one. Scott, I was wondering if you would comment on what I would refer to as the factionalization of news consumers and the perception, the kind of persistent perception of bias in news reporting, and how that affects your job and the other people who are trying to do the job you do.
It's a really pernicious problem, and not just because NPR gets tagged a certain way, or Fox News gets tarred a certain way, or MSNBC gets tarred a certain way. Of course, in our case, it's not true. But it's a real problem for our democracy. You know, as the old saying goes, everyone's entitled to his opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. And it's pretty hard to have a civic discourse if we're not dealing with a common set of facts. And that doesn't necessarily mean we all have to be getting our news from the same source, but we do have to be getting our news from the same planet. And sometimes it seems like we're not. And also, I should be able to, I should be able to read, and I mean, when I read the Wall Street Journal, which has an editorial page that's very different than the editorial page of the New York Times, I have just as much faith in the news columns of the Wall Street Journal as the news columns of the New York Times, or and vice versa. I trust the reporters on both those outlets. But I know a lot of people that's not true. A lot of people, I mean, that's not true of my mom. I'm not going to tell you which one she believes, but and that's pretty hard to have a democracy in that setting. I think we have to have some sort of common set of facts that we work from. And the polarization of the media is both a symptom and a exacerbating cause of the larger polarization in our society. And I don't pretend to have a solution for it, but I think it's a very worrisome trend. I will say, a couple weeks ago I'd been covering I guess I was in the midst of covering the back and forth. The Prop 8 case was brewing in the news, and there happened to be an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about the Boy Scouts' position on gays. And it was a really skillfully written piece. And I guess this was deliberate. You didn't really know until the end how the writer was going to come down on what the Boy Scouts' position on gays was. But he had a lot of interesting things to say, and as a Eagle Scout, proud former Boy Scout, you know, I had some interest in what he had to say. And in the end, he came out saying that the Boy Scouts needed to make a change in their policy towards gays. And I frankly don't know what the Wall Street Journal's editorial stance on that's been throughout history, but I thought that this piece probably carried more weight for appearing in the op-ed pages of the Wall Street Journal than it might have had it appeared in an outlet where that would have sort of been the obvious position for the writer to come down on. And you know, I don't read a lot of editorial pages generally, but the columnists I find most interesting are the ones that I don't usually know until I get to the end of their piece what their conclusion is going to be. If I know what their conclusion is going to be at the start, I don't learn very much. And I think too much of our media has kind of fallen into that category, and there aren't enough where you're sort of discovering things together as you go along. So I guess that's, if there's a prescription, and I don't know how we encourage more of that, but I think we should try.
Scott, thanks for joining us tonight. It's a really terrific discussion. Thanks to all of you for coming out. Thanks to KPR for making tonight possible. It's been a great evening. See you next time. Oh, wait a minute. We got to do a drawing. I almost forgot about that. Clarissa was going to get me if I blew that one. So this is a drawing for a friend membership, right? And you have to be present to win. So if you're leaving, oh, this is great. Karen Lewis. Karen, where are you? Karen's one of our Student Advisory Board members. Hey, awesome. Thank you all for coming tonight. That was very entertaining, very, very nicely done.